The rain hammered the roof like 1,000 tiny accusations, each drop echoing the knot in my stomach that had been tightening since George left for that conference in Chicago. I paced the living room of his family's old Victorian in suburban Boston, the kind of house that smelled like polished oak and unspoken regrets, wondering if I'd made a mistake agreeing to house-sit while he was gone. Then the front door creaked open without warning, and there stood George's father, soaked to the bone, his eyes locking onto mine with a fury that said he'd seen too much already. His name was Richard Hale, but to me he was always just Mr. Hale, the man who'd built walls around his son higher than the ones enclosing their backyard garden. He dropped his suitcase with a thud that rattled the antique sideboard, water pooling at his feet like spilled secrets. "Timothy," he growled, his voice rough as the gravel driveway outside. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" I froze, the mug of cooling coffee slipping from my fingers to shatter on the hardwood floor. Shards scattered like the fragile pretense we'd all been living under for years, George's secret, my unwavering love, and the elder Hale's ironclad denial. In that moment, with thunder rumbling like a judgment from the gods of New England winters, I knew the storm inside was about to break wide open. The drive from Logan Airport had been a blur for Richard Hale, the wipers slapping rhythmically against the relentless downpour as if trying to erase the image burned into his mind. He'd cut his trip short, some half-baked excuse about a family emergency he couldn't quite articulate to his colleagues, because the photo had arrived via text from an old neighbor, grainy but unmistakable. His son George, arms slung casually around another man at a Cambridge cafe, both of them laughing in a way that twisted something deep in Richard's chest. Not just any man. Timothy freaking Riley, the college buddy George had mentioned in passing, the one who'd shown up at holidays with that easy smile and eyes that lingered a beat too long. Richard gripped the steering wheel tighter as he merged onto Route 2, the suburbs of Arlington unfolding like a faded postcard from his own youth. Back then, life had been simpler. Factory jobs, Friday night football under the floodlights, and a marriage to Ellen that started with promise and ended in quiet dissolution when George was 12. He'd raised his boy alone after that, pouring every ounce of his auto shop grit into making sure George had a shot at something better. A degree from Harvard Law, a corner office in Boston's financial district, a life that looked like success on paper. Gaze? That was for the cities down south or those artsy types in Provincetown. Not his boy. Not in this house, with its faded American flags on the porch and photos of Little League triumphs lining the mantel. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the rain had turned the world to gray smears. The house lights glowed warmly through the storm, a betrayal in themselves. He fumbled with his keys, the door swinging open to the scent of chamomile tea and something faintly citrusy. Timothy's cologne, no doubt. And there he was, in the heart of the living room, barefoot in sweatpants and a faded Red Sox tee, looking every bit the intruder Richard's gut had screamed he was. "Mr. Hale," Timothy stammered, his face draining of color as he bent to grab a dish towel, dabbing uselessly at the coffee spill. I thought you weren't back till Sunday," George said. George said a lot of things that weren't true, apparently. Richard's voice came out sharper than he intended, laced with the exhaustion of a man who'd spent the flight staring at that photo, replaying every awkward family dinner where Timothy had been just a friend. He shrugged off his drenched coat, letting it slap wetly onto the floor. "You gonna stand there gawking? Or you gonna explain why you're squatting in my home like it's yours?" Timothy straightened, his hazel eyes flickering with a mix of defiance and hurt that Richard hadn't expected. At 28, he was all lean muscle from weekend hikes in the White Mountains and that freelance graphic design gig that let him flit around like some bohemian ghost. But tonight, under the harsh glow of the overhead light, he looked smaller, more human. "I'm house-sitting, like I always do when George is away. The pipes freeze if no one's here. Remember? You asked me to last summer." Richard snorted, kicking the door shut behind him. The sound echoed like a gavel. "Yeah, well, things change. Sit down, kid. We need to talk." Timothy hesitated, then nodded, perching on the edge of the leather armchair that had been Ellen's favorite. Richard lumbered to the couch opposite, the one where he'd nursed George through chicken pox and heartbreak over a high school sweetheart who turned out to be all wrong. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with their gallery of framed achievements. George's valedictorian plaque, his Little League MVP ribbon, a faded snapshot of father and son at Fenway Park, arms around each other under a summer sky. No room for this for them. So, Richard started, rubbing his stubbled jaw. That picture, the one from the cafe. You want to tell me what's really going on between you and my son? Timothy's swallow was audible over the rain's patter. He set the towel aside, fingers twisting in his lap. It's not what you think. Or, maybe it is. George and we've been together for 2 years now. More than friends. I love him, Mr. Hale. And he loves me. The words landed like a sucker punch, stealing Richard's breath. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the man who'd just dismantled his world with 8 quiet syllables. Love. The word he'd whispered to Ellen under starlit drives. The one he'd failed to say enough after she left. And now here it was, twisted into something he couldn't fathom, thrown at him by a stranger in his own living room. You're lying? Richard muttered. But it came out weak. More plea than accusation. George wouldn't. He's got a future. A real one. Not this confusion. It's not confusion. Timothy's voice steadied, gaining an edge honed from too many late-night arguments with George about coming out. It's who he is, and hiding it is killing him. You saw the photo. Did he look confused to you? He looked happy, for once. Richard's mind reeled back to the image. George's head thrown back in laughter, Timothy's hand on his shoulder. The easy intimacy of 2 people who fit. It wasn't the son he'd raised, the one who'd buried himself in books to escape the whispers after Ellen left, the one who'd aced every exam to prove he was unbreakable. This George was alive in a way Richard hadn't seen since boyhood. Get out, Richard said finally, the words tasting like ash. Pack your shit and go. I'll deal with George myself. Timothy didn't move. Rain lashed the windows, thunder growling low. No, not until you hear me out. Because this isn't just about us. It's about you and him. And if you send me away now, you'll lose him for good. The clock on the mantel ticked mercilessly, marking the seconds of a standoff neither man wanted but both knew was inevitable. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the real tempest was just beginning to brew. Timothy's defiance hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, thick and choking. He hadn't planned on this. Not tonight, not ever, really. House-sitting was supposed to be a quiet interlude. Feeding the ancient tabby cat named Whiskers, watering the overgrown ferns in the sunroom, and losing himself in sketches of Boston's foggy harbors while George charmed clients at his law firm's annual retreat. 2 years into their relationship, these stolen moments in the Hale house felt like a fragile bridge between Timothy's nomadic freelance life and George's buttoned-up world of depositions and donor galas. But bridges, as Timothy knew from too many collapsed ones in his own past, could buckle under unexpected weight. And Richard Hale, with his broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of engines rebuilt and fences mended, was a goddamn freight train. Hear you out, Richard echoed, his laugh bitter as black coffee. What, you think you know my son better than I do? I changed his diapers, kid. Taught him how to throw a curveball. Watched him cry when his mom walked out and swore I'd never let him hurt like that again. Timothy leaned forward, mirroring the older man's posture, his heart pounding a rhythm that drowned out the rain. And that's exactly why I'm not leaving, because George still cries over that. Over you shutting down every time he tries to talk about anything real. Remember last Thanksgiving? When he mentioned that trip to Provincetown, and you changed the subject to the Patriots draft picks. Richard's face hardened, lines etching deeper around his mouth. Provincetown, the artsy weekend with buddies that George had spun as a lark. Richard had let it slide then, chalking it up to post-graduation blowing off steam. But now, with Timothy's words slicing through the fog, it all clicked into place. The late nights George claimed were case prep. The way his son's closet had mysteriously filled with fitted shirts instead of the baggy polos Richard favored. The hesitant pride in George's voice when he talked about someone special without ever naming names. Shut your mouth, Richard snapped. But there was a crack in it, a tremor that betrayed the bluff. He rose abruptly, crossing to the sideboard for a tumbler and the half-empty bottle of bourbon Ellen had left behind. The amber liquid glugged out, steadying his hands if not his nerves. You think love fixes everything? I loved my wife, deep, the kind that guts you. And look what it got me. A kid too scared to be straight with his own father. Timothy watched him, the glass catching the lamplight like a flawed diamond. He'd met Richard a dozen times. Barbecues in the backyard where the older man grilled burgers with mechanical precision. Holiday toasts where eyes slid away from Timothy's like he was a polite afterthought. George had warned him, Dad's old school. World War II vets in his family tree, all that macho bullshit. He loves me, but he doesn't get this. And yet, Timothy had always sensed the undercurrent. The way Richard's gruff questions about Timothy's plans carried a veiled hope that he'd vanish, clearing the path for the son he could brag about at the VFW hall. It's not about fixing, Timothy said softly, rising to his feet. He stepped closer, careful not to crowd, the coffee shards crunching under his socked feet, a reminder of how quickly normalcy could shatter. It's about letting him be. George is brilliant, yeah? Top of his class, arguing cases that change lives. But he's exhausted from the mask. From lying to you, to his colleagues, to himself on the days it all feels too heavy. Richard took a long pull from the glass, the burn grounding him. He studied Timothy then, really looked. The faint scar above his left eyebrow from a biking mishap in Somerville, the ink stains on his fingertips from late-night doodles, the quiet strength in his stance that reminded Richard, uncomfortably, of his own younger self, before life sanded down the edges. And you? What's in it for you? Playing white knight in someone else's castle. Timothy's laugh was short, self-deprecating. Nothing heroic. I fell for him at that stupid alumni mixer, him in his suit quoting Ginsberg like it was small talk. He's got this fire, Mr. Hale, this way of seeing the world that's all heart and no apologies. Except with you. And it kills me to watch. Thunder boomed, shaking the windows, and whiskers yowled from the kitchen, demanding supper amid the chaos. Richard set the glass down, the clink punctuating the silence. Ginsberg, huh? Figures. Ellen was into that beatnik crap. Left me a stack of his books in the attic. He paused, eyes drifting to the mantel photo. George at 10, gap-toothed grin under a backward cap. He used to read to me, sci-fi stuff mostly, escapes. The admission slipped out unbidden, a crack in the armor. Timothy seized it gently. He still does that with me. Reads aloud on rainy nights like this. Last week, it was Howl. Said it reminded him of fighting for what's real. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to rage, to shove this interloper out into the storm and call George, demand answers in the clipped tones of a father betrayed. But the words stuck, tangled in memories of bedtime stories and baseball gloves tossed in the yard. Betrayal? Maybe. But whose? George's for hiding or his own for never asking? All right, Richard grunted finally, sinking back onto the couch. Talk. But if this is some pitch to understand me, save it. I just want my boy back. Timothy nodded, settling across from him again. The rain eased to a steady drum, the room warming as the old radiator hissed to life. And so it began, not with accusations but with stories. Timothy spoke of their first real date, a clunky affair at a dive bar in the North End, where George's nerves had him spilling marinara sauce down his shirt, turning catastrophe into laughter. Richard listened, bourbon forgotten, as the portrait of his son emerged. Not the polished lawyer, but a man of vulnerabilities and joys Richard had missed. Hours slipped by, the clock striking midnight unnoticed. Whiskers curled between them on the rug, a furry mediator. Richard shared fragments of his own youth. The Korean War draft notice that never came, the factory layoff that pushed him into mechanics, the night Ellen confessed she felt trapped by his all-American dream. I thought providing was enough, he admitted, voice gravelly. Turns out, it's the talking that sticks. Timothy absorbed it, seeing echoes of George in the man's guarded hope. The same jaw set against the world, the same flicker of warmth when stories turned tender. By the time the storm broke, dawn's gray light filtering through lace curtains, something had shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but a tentative bridge, planks laid over the chasm. "You staying?" Richard asked, standing with a stiffness born of age and ache. Timothy glanced at his phone. No messages from George. The conference Wi-Fi spotty as ever. "Till Sunday, unless you say otherwise." Richard grunted, a non-answer that felt like permission. "Coffee, black. Then you can show me that garden out back. George always said you had a green thumb." As Timothy moved to the kitchen, Richard lingered, tracing the photo frame. The house felt less like a tomb, more like a place where ghosts might finally speak. But outside, the cleared sky belied the clouds still gathering. George's return loomed, and with it, the real test. The next morning dawned crisp and unforgiving, the kind of New England autumn day that painted the maples in fire but chilled the bones to the marrow. Timothy woke on the guest room couch, neck kinked from the throw pillow, the faint scent of bourbon and rain clinging to his clothes. Downstairs, the clatter of pans told him Richard was up. Making amends, perhaps, or just hungry. Whiskers twined around his ankles as he descended, a silent vote of confidence. In the kitchen, Richard hunched over the stove, flipping eggs with the focus of a man defusing a bomb. The radio hummed low, NPR's morning edition dissecting some congressional gridlock in D.C. Politics as usual, a safe harbor for uneasy silences. "Sit," Richard said without turning, sliding a plate across the scarred oak table. "Bacon's crisp. Like it or lump it." Timothy obeyed, the normalcy jarring after last night's raw confessions. "Thanks. Smells like heaven." He forked into the eggs, the yolk bursting warm and familiar. "You sleep okay?" "Like a rock." A lie, judging by the shadows under Richard's eyes, but Timothy let it slide. The older man poured coffee, black as midnight, and settled across from him. "Heard from George." Timothy checked his phone again. Still nothing. Radio silence. Probably neck-deep in mock trials. He hesitated, then added, "He'll be thrilled you're back early." Or, terrified. Richard's fork paused midair. "Terrified. Yeah. That's on me." He chewed slowly, gaze drifting to the window where the backyard stretched, leaves swirling in eddies. Used to build forts out there with him. Cardboard and old tarps. Called it Hail Fortress. Invincible. Timothy smiled faintly, picturing it. A boyish George, all gangly limbs and imagination, under his father's watchful eye. "He told me about that. Said it's where he first dreamed of being a lawyer, defending the kingdom from invaders." A ghost of a chuckle escaped Richard. "Invaders. Life's full of 'em." He set his fork down, the clink deliberate. "Last night, you didn't sugarcoat it. Most kids would have bolted." "Kids?" Timothy arched a brow, lightening the air. "I'm pushing 30, and bolting's not my style. Not with George." Richard nodded, sipping his coffee. The steam curled like unspoken questions. "Tell me about him. The real him. Not the resume crap." And so Timothy did, words flowing easier in daylight. He painted George at 25, fresh out of law school, interning at a pro bono clinic in Roxbury, fighting evictions for families who'd lost everything in the '08 crash. Eyes lit up like Christmas. Every win. But the losses, he'd come home wrecked, questioning if justice was just a fancy word for delay. Richard leaned in, absorbing the layers. The George who volunteered at the local LGBTQ center, anonymously at first, then with quiet pride. The one who baked lopsided apple pies from Ellen's old recipe, burning the crust but nailing the filling. The lover who whispered poetry in the dark, tracing Timothy's scars like they were constellations. "He's got your fight," Timothy finished. "That stubborn Hale grit, but he tempers it with heart. Makes him unstoppable." Unstoppable. The word lodged in Richard's chest, a mix of pride and pang. He'd always seen George's drive as his own legacy, the shop-to-office climb, the refusal to bend. But heart? That was Ellen's gift, the one he'd dismissed as softness until it walked out the door. "Sounds like a good man," Richard said gruffly. "Better than his old man. Don't sell yourself short." Timothy pushed his plate aside. You raised him solo. That's no small feat. The radio droned on, pivoting to a segment on marriage equality. A Massachusetts milestone, now federal law, but battles raging in red states. Richard muted it with a jab of his thumb. Heard about that Obergefell case. George called from D.C. that day, excited as a pup. I grunted something non-committal. Timothy's eyes softened. He waited for that call. Hoped you'd say more. Silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. Then Richard stood, rinsing plates with methodical splashes. Garden. You weren't kidding about the thumb. Those ferns look like they could use a trim. They worked side by side that afternoon, shears snipping in companionable rhythm. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, a cycle of renewal Richard hadn't pondered in years. Timothy shared stories of his own fractured family. Irish Catholic folks in Southie, who'd disowned him at 19 after finding his sketchbook full of boys' faces. Hurt like hell, he admitted, clipping a wilted frond. But it freed me. Met George 6 months later, and bam, home. Richard paused, dirt-caked gloves in hand. My folks, they were stoics. Dad lost a brother in Normandy, never spoke of it. Taught me men swallow the hurt. He glanced at Timothy, appraising. Swallowing's overrated. By dusk, the garden gleamed tidier, a metaphor neither voiced. They shared a beer on the back porch, the city lights twinkling distant across the Charles River. Richard's phone buzzed. A text from an old VFW buddy about a game. He typed a reply, then hesitated. You ever think about settling? Rings and all. Timothy's beer paused at his lips. With George? Every day. But he's gun-shy. Fears it'll blow up with you. Richard stared into his bottle, condensation beating like tears. Won't lie, it's a gut punch. Picturing my boy with you. But seeing him happy, that might be the trade-off. The admission hovered, fragile as the first frost. Timothy's phone lit up then. George, finally. Landed early. Home tonight. Miss you. Love, G. Heart emoji, a rarity for the stoic lawyer. Tell him to come straight here, Richard said, voice steady. We got talking to do. All three of us. Timothy texted back, thumbs flying. Storms cleared. Dad's waiting. See you soon. He hit send, pulse racing. The bridge held for now. But as headlights pierced the twilight hours later, pulling into the drive, Timothy braced. George stepped out, suit rumpled from travel, duffel slung over his shoulder. His eyes met Timothy's through the screen door, confusion melting to alarm as Richard appeared behind, arms crossed but not clenched. Dad? What? Inside, son. Richard cut in, the words gruff but open. Got some fences to mend. George's gaze darted between them, reading the shift in the air, the unspoken truce. He dropped his bag, stepping over the threshold not as a prodigal, but as a son reclaiming his place. The door clicked shut, sealing them in for the reckoning. George Hale had always been a planner, calendars color-coded, arguments mapped like battlefields, risks calculated to the decimal. But as he crossed the threshold of his childhood home, duffel thudding forgotten at his feet, every strategy crumbled. There stood Timothy, hair tousled from garden work, a faint smudge of soil on his cheek like war paint. And behind him, his father, Richard, the immovable object, arms folded, jaw set, but eyes softer, somehow like the edges of a storm-worn stone. Dad? George repeated, voice cracking on the word. The flight from Chicago had been turbulent, mirroring the churn in his gut over that damned neighbor's photo. He'd spotted the text en route. Your boy's making headlines in the funny papers, and spent the descent drafting apologies, explanations. Please, but this? Timothy's steady gaze said volumes. Not disaster, but détente. You're back early. And, Tim, what's going on? Richard jerked his head toward the living room. Sit. Beer. George nodded numbly, shedding his coat as he followed. The house enveloped him like an old coat. Creaky stairs, the faint must of the wool runner, whiskers slinking out to weave figure eights around his ankles. Timothy brushed his arm in passing, a featherlight touch loaded with reassurance. We're okay. For now. They settled in the familiar tableau. George on the couch's end cushion, the one with the spring that poked just right. Richard in his armchair, popping the cap on a Sam Adams with practiced flick. Timothy cross-legged on the ottoman, bridging them like a diplomat in jeans. The TV flickered on mute, some Celtics rerun. A neutral backdrop to the minefield ahead. So, George started, accepting the bottle with clammy hands. The photo, Mrs. Hargrove. She's got binoculars like a hawk. I'm sorry, Dad. I was gonna tell you. After the promotion, when things stabilized. Richard waved it off, the gesture gruff but not dismissive. Save the speech, counselor. Tim beat you to it. Spilled the whole damn novel last night. George's eyes widened, flicking to Timothy. You. What? Storm hit, Timothy said simply, his half-smile a lifeline. Your dad came home soaked and swinging. We talked. A lot. Talked. The word landed like a revelation. George had spent years scripting this moment in his head. Slammed doors, shouted ultimatums, the slow bleed of estrangement. Instead, here they were, beers sweating rings on coasters, the air thick with possibility rather than pitchforks. And, he pressed, voice barely above the TV's hum. What did you say? Richard took a pull, buying time. He said you love him, that you're happy, that I've been a blind fool. Raising a son I don't know half as well as I thought. George's throat tightened, the cold bottle a shock against his palm. Happy. It was such a small word for the vastness of it. The way Timothy's laugh could uncoil the knots in his chest after a brutal deposition. The quiet mornings in their cramped Cambridge apartment where sunlight slanted through blinds and made everything feel infinite. Dad, it's true. Tim's. He's my anchor. In a world that feels like it's always shifting under my feet. Richard's gaze bored into him, searching for the boy he'd lost to Harvard's Ivy Towers. Shifting, huh? Like when your mom left. You were 12, asking why she didn't love us enough to stay. I told you it wasn't about love, it was choices. Bad ones. George nodded, the memory a scar that ached in quiet moments. Ellen's departure had been a slow unraveling. Late nights at her gallery job, arguments over Richard's overtime, a final note on the fridge. I need air to breathe. She'd send postcards from Santa Fe, watercolor sunsets and cryptic updates, but never returned. George had filled the void with A's and extracurriculars, a shield against the abandonment. I get that now, he said. Choices, like me choosing to hide this from you, afraid it'd be another loss. The room stilled, the weight of it settling. Timothy watched, silent sentinel, his presence a steady hum. Richard leaned forward, elbows on knees, the posture of confession. Wasn't gonna be easy hearing it, still ain't. Picturing you two, together, is like rewiring the house after it's built. Messy. But Tim, he didn't run. Told me about your clinic days, the pies, the poetry. Made me see the man, not the label. George's breath hitched. Poetry. He'd shared that with Timothy first, Ginsberg and Whitman dog-eared in his undergrad dorm. Verses that named the ache he couldn't voice at home. You hate it, don't you? The gay part. Richard's sigh was ragged. Hate? Nah. Confused, maybe. Scared you'll get hurt. In a world that don't always roll out the welcome mat. But hate? That's not us, son. Hales don't quit on family. The words cracked something in George, tears pricking hot and unbidden. He swiped at them, laughing shakily. Jesus, Dad. You're killing me here. Timothy reached over, squeezing his knee. A touch that grounded, that said breathe. Told you he's got heart under the grease. They talked then, really talked, the beers giving way to takeout from the corner Italian place. Meatballs and marinara, comfort food that bridged generations. George shared the terror of the closet. The colleague who'd outed himself and lost clients. The family friend shunned after coming out at 50. It's not just you, Dad. It's the fallout. But hiding? That's poison. Richard listened, interjecting with grunts and questions about their future, rings, kids maybe one day through surrogacy or adoption. World's changing, he mused over tiramisu. Obergefell was 6 months back. Hell, the shop's got a trans kid working the counter now. Calls himself Alex. Good with alignments. George's grin broke wide, genuine. Alex? Tell him I said hi. And yeah, Tim and I were thinking long-term. If you'll have us around. Richard raised his glass, the clink a pact. Hale Fortress always has room. But no more secrets. Deal? Deal. The word sealed it, tentative but true. As night deepened, George and Timothy retreated upstairs, the guest room door clicking soft. In the tangle of sheets, George's whispers were fervent. You faced him down. For us. Timothy's kiss was answer enough, tender and affirming. But in the hall, Richard lingered by the banister, ear pressed not to eavesdrop but to listen. To the life his son had built, brave and unapologetic. Sleep came slow, dreams laced with forts and unfamiliar hands clasped in his own. Dawn brought normalcy. Coffee brewing, plans for brunch at the diner on Mass Avenue. But as they laughed over pancakes, George's phone buzzed. A work email, innocuous. Richard's did too. The VFW buddy again, this time with a forwarded article on Pride events in Boston. You going? The text read. Richard typed back. Maybe. With the boys. He hit send, the future unfolding not as threat, but horizon. Yet beneath the warmth, fissures lingered, unseen, waiting for pressure. For betrayal wore many faces, and some wounds reopened in the quiet. Weeks blurred into the relentless churn of November, leaves surrendering to bare branches as Boston hunkered down for winter's siege. For George and Timothy, the thaw with Richard felt like sunlight-piercing fog. Tentative rays, but enough to warm the chill. Dinners became ritual. Richard's hearty stews in the Victorian's kitchen, stories swapped over candlelight when power flickered out. George brought Timothy openly now, no side entrance excuses, and Richard's gruff pass the bread. Tim carried the weight of acceptance earned. But acceptance, George learned, was a garden too, prone to weeds if untended. At the firm, whispers slithered. A partner eyeing him sideways after the photo surfaced in office gossip. A client pulling a case citing personal misalignment. George brushed it off to Timothy, burying stress in late-night briefs. But the strain etched lines around his eyes. It's fine, he'd insist, kissing Timothy's temple. Dad's on board. That's the win. Timothy nodded, but worry gnawed. His freelance gigs, book covers for indie presses, murals for Somerville cafes. Paid erratic, leaving him pacing their apartment while George chased billable hours. Richard noticed, too, during a Sunday football watch. George glued to his phone mid-play, jaw tight. That work? The older man asked, tossing a handful of peanuts. Yeah, just fallout. George waved it away. Nothing I can't handle. Richard's eyes narrowed, mechanic's instinct kicking in. Handle like you handled telling me? Or handle like burying it till it rusts through? The barb landed, but gentle. George sighed, admitting the client loss. Richard grunted. World's full of assholes. Find ones who see your worth. He clapped George's shoulder, the gesture solid. Proud of you, kid. For all of it. The words lingered. A bomb. But storms brewed elsewhere. Timothy's family, ghosts from Southie, resurfaced via a holiday card. Stiff and signed, but enclosed with a check. For the nephew we still pray for. Timothy crumpled it, hurt flaring fresh. They think money erases disowning me. George held him through the night, murmuring plans for their own traditions. A tree in the Hale backyard, lights strung with Richard's reluctant help. We're building ours, he promised. Stronger. Yet the fracture came swift, betrayal cloaked in familiarity. It was mid-December, snow dusting the commons like powdered sugar, when Richard called George into the study after a boisterous Hale-Riley fusion dinner. Timothy's shepherd's pie alongside Richard's chili. Got something for you, Richard said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside, brochures for a reparative therapy retreat in upstate New York, testimonials glowing with restored normalcy. George's stomach plummeted. Dad, what is this? Richard shifted, uncomfortable in his own skin. Heard about it from the VFW chaplain. For folks like, well, you. Not saying you need fixing, son. Just options. In case the world's too rough. The room spun, the brochure's glossy lies mocking the progress they'd clawed for. Betrayal, not malice, but fear's cruel echo. George stood, voice steel. Options? This is poison, Dad. You think a weekend seminar erases who I am? Who I love? Richard's face crumpled, defenses cracking. I panicked, all right? Saw that article. Some kid sued his parents after coming out. Bankrupted him. Thought, if there's a way to shield you. Shield me by shaming me? George's laugh was hollow. Tim heard you laugh with him last week. Shared beers. And now this. Timothy, drawn by raised voices, appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. Richard's gaze darted to him, shame flooding. Tim, it's not. Save it. Timothy's tone was even, but edged. We trusted you. He turned to George. Let's go. Your place. They left in a swirl of snow, the drive to Cambridge silent fury. In their apartment, George paced, the betrayal a live wire. He means well. Always has. But God. Tim. How many steps back? Timothy pulled him close, heartbeat steady against the storm. Steps forward take detours. But he called it in. Means he's still trying. George clung, the love between them a fierce anchor. Days passed in frost. Radio silence from the Hale house, George's texts unanswered. Timothy sketched furiously. Fierce abstracts of fractured homes, catharsis on canvas. Richard, meanwhile, stewed in regret, the brochures consigned to the trash. He drove to the VFW, cornered the chaplain. That crap you peddled? It's lies. My boy's gay, and he's the best damn man I know. The chaplain backpedaled, but the seed was planted. Richard's walls crumbling further. Christmas Eve, he showed at their door, unannounced, bearing a pie, burnt crust, perfect filling. Ellen's recipe, he mumbled, hat in hands. Screwed up again. Can I explain? George hesitated. Timothy's gnawed the decider. Inside, over eggnog laced with apology, Richard spilled. The article's fear, his own buried insecurities from a youth of taunts over his soft father. Thought I was protecting you, but it's your life, son, not mine to reroute. Tears flowed then, George's release, Timothy's quiet grace, Richard's raw admission. I love you, the older man said to both, the words encompassing. Queer or not, your family. The pie was shared, laughter tentative but real. Outside, snow fell soft, blanketing old wounds. But high drama loomed. New Year's, a firm gala where George's hand in Timothy's would be public, irreversible. Invitations arrived, Richard's RSVP a scrawled hell yes. Yet as confetti loomed, a shadow. The partner who'd pulled the client, now pushing for George's resignation, citing firm image. Betrayal doubled, corporate blade to the heart. The gala loomed like a guillotine wrapped in tinsel. The Boston Harbor Hotel's ballroom aglow with chandeliers and champagne flutes. A glittering facade for the cutthroat world of Hale and Associates. George had prepped for weeks. Speech polished, tie knotted military straight. But the email from senior partner Harlan Graves had unraveled it all. Meet privately post-event. Regarding your future, the subtext screamed. The photo, the whispers, the misfit label slapped on a rising star. In their apartment, mirror fogged from Timothy's shower, George adjusted his cufflinks, knuckles white. It's a shakedown, he muttered. Harlan's old money country club set. Thinks queers scare off the blue blood clients. Timothy emerged, towel around his waist, water beating on his chest like unshed tears. He stepped close, fingers deft on George's bow tie. Then fight it, like you fight everything with facts and fire. George's laugh was brittle. Facts? Harlan's got tenure. I got us. He cupped Timothy's face, thumb tracing the scar. If I walk away, it's back to square one. Clinic work pays peanuts. And if you stay silent? Timothy's eyes held steady, the lover's challenge. We lose you piece by piece. Downstairs, Richard waited in his best blazer, faded but pressed, nursing a coffee from the lobby cart. He'd insisted on escorting. A gruff, hale men stick together masking nerves. Spotting them, he straightened. "You two clean up nice. Tim, that vest makes you look like a damn model." Timothy grinned, easing the tension. "Flattery? From you? Must be the end times." The ballroom swallowed them in opulence. Jazz quartet lilting, power couples air-kissing under crystal. George navigated with practiced charm, handshakes, quips about the latest SCOTUS ruling. But his eyes scanned for Harlan, the wolf in Brooks Brothers. Richard, out of his depth amid the legalese, stuck to Timothy, bonding over the open bar. "Your boy's tense as a rusted bolt," he murmured over scotch. "What's the play?" Timothy hesitated, then spilled the email. Richard's face darkened. "That pencil neck? No." Timothy gripped his arm. "George's battle. But stay close." The speech came at 9. George at the podium, lights hot on his skin, voice resonant as he touted the firm's pro bono wins. Evictions halted, rights reclaimed. "Justice isn't boardroom privilege," he declared, gaze finding Timothy in the crowd, Richard nodding fierce beside him. "It's a promise to the vulnerable. And tonight we recommit." Applause thundered, but Harlan's followed Harlan's, polite, predatory. Post-event, in a side salon of velvet drapes and leather Chesterfields, the axe fell. "George," Harlan began, cigar smoke curling like deceit. "Talented, yes, but optics. The board's concerned. Discretion's key in our circles." George's pulse roared. "Discretion? You mean hiding who I am? For your Rolodex?" Harlan leaned in, voice oily. "Think family. Stability. We've all made sacrifices." Sacrifice. The word ignited George. The closet's cage. Richard's misguided brochures. Ellen's ghost. He stood, chair scraping. "My family's here, and they see me clear. If that's not your brand, find another frontman." He stormed out, heart hammering, into the fray where Timothy and Richard waited. "Done," he announced, the weight lifting. "Walked." Richard's whoop startled a waiter. "Attaboy. Knew you had it." Timothy pulled him into shadow, kiss fierce amid the swirl. "Proud doesn't cover it." But climax crested not in triumph, but trial. Harlan's retaliation swift. A leaked memo painting George as unprofessional. Clients poached overnight. Bills piled. Freelance for Timothy stretched thin. Richard offered his savings. Hail Fortress Fund. But pride warred with need. Nights blurred in worry. Love their soul light. George reading Whitman aloud. Timothy sketching their future home. Richard dropping casseroles with dad jokes. Winter deepened. Snowdrifts burying doubts. Then, renewal. A call from a Roxbury clinic, headhunting George for director. Pro bono scaled up. Impact real. "Heard you stood up," the recruiter said. "We need that fire." Acceptance bloomed. Spring unfurled tentative. Cherry blossoms along the esplanade. Richard at their engagement dinner, toasting with shaky hands. To choices, good ones. The ring, simple gold, bound them under April sun. Yet humanity's arc bent bittersweet. Richard's health faltered that summer. Prostate scare, chemo's grind. But in hospital rooms, hands linked across generations. Love proved the deepest medicine. "Regret nothing," he rasped to George, Timothy at bedside. "You taught me that." Richard rallied, slower but wiser. VFW speeches now laced with ally anthems. George thrived at the clinic, cases won in courtrooms of compassion. Timothy's art flourished. Galleries in the South End, portraits of fractured families mending. On their first anniversary, backyard vows under string lights, Richard officiated, voice thick. "In this house, we learn talk changes everything. Love endures." As stars wheeled over Boston, George whispered to Timothy, "Our honest talk, worth every storm." And in the quiet, they believed it human, flawed, unbreakable.